always harder when the weather's nice. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Melton, who was recruited by DES to come to the Center for Global Health, and I'm just not going to read everything, but Gary and his wife have been very involved in children's rights. They've also been very involved in education and have a terrific program in Albania on children's rights. And he has an international reputation, and I wish there were more people here to hear Gary, but those of us that are here will, I'm sure, enjoy his presentation. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, what I'd like to do is to give a quick overview about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, given that this is presumably the either very obsessive or very interested group, or people that for whom that may be superfluous, but just to sort of be on the safe side, as they say. And then to talk in particular about the right to participate, and then still more particularly Article 12 of the Convention, and then to go from there a bit to how the right to participate can be best actualized. This is an area or a topic that I've been involved with in one way or another for a very long time, really since graduate school, I guess, which is a very long time. But I consulted to the Committee on the Rights of the Child and UNICEF in 2006, I think it was, somewhere in there, when they were drafting General Comment Number 12, which is on the right to be heard, as it's defined in that document, but essentially it's the right to participate. And had worked with a number of national governments, most closely the Israeli one, as they were trying to make their domestic laws compatible with their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the history of of the Convention on the Rights of the Child has much to do with the way it ultimately looked. I guess that's almost a tautological thing to say. But the timing on it was really critical, in that the convention was proposed by Poland in 1979 during the as an observance of the International Year of the Child. And of course, this was during communist era Poland. And what they proposed, in essence, in the first document was to take the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which is a fairly platitudinous document, all completely related to protection rights, and then to convert that to a legal instrument was the plan. And that was referred to a committee by the General Assembly, a working group of essentially whoever wanted to come. It was a first in a variety of ways. One is that it was the first time that NGOs formally had a seat at the table, so that the NGO caucus had an elected representative who was involved in the working group. It was also the first time that the relevant UN agencies were formally, again, invited and involved in the drafting. I should say, at least by my perspective, at the beginning, that was not necessarily a constructive role, and that UNICEF in the early days of the drafting was systematically attempting to undermine the instrument, in that they viewed it as being the children's rights emphasis at that time as being inconsistent with UNICEF's focus on child survival, and saw it as a distraction in essence. So it was only well into the drafting period, when it was clear this was going to be a fait accompli, and would have many countries as parties, that UNICEF became actively and positively involved. A long drafting period. It is by far the longest of the children's rights instruments that had been developed up until that time, and certainly by far the most coherent, in that it has not just self-determination rights and nurturance rights, but both, and has them integrated with a focus on children's dignity. It's a remarkably coherent document. And what makes it more remarkable is that it was a document that essentially was a least common denominator sort of approach. That is, that the working group operated under was one of consensus. So that this is the lowest level that everybody that was involved in the working group would agree to. And the chair of the working group was Adam Lopatka, who's a Polish law professor who at the time of the motion was the Minister of Religious Affairs in the, again, former communist regime. And Adam is I don't know him well, but by all appearances, and from what my personal experience with him has been, is he's a kind of a classic Soviet-era bureaucrat. But he did that job really well in terms of never deciding anything. And so his style was that when one of the Western governments, the United States or one of its allies, would propose civil liberties, and the coalition of then Soviet allies plus the Muslim countries plus China and Japan at times would object, then he would say, in essence, the representative of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the representative of the United States of America, and the representative of some other country that was involved in the motion on that particular item, just hypothetically, Sweden, should go and have coffee, basically. And they would come back the next morning with language that was the lowest common denominator. So I mention that because this is a document that, again, is theoretically elegant, even though it's very long. But it came from a political process that it's hard to imagine would get to that result. I was good friends with the United Kingdom's delegate, and since people sit by alphabetical order, he was between the USA and the USSR for this whole drafting period. It was a very uncomfortable position, apparently. One thing I should note, which is relevant to the objections to U.S. ratification at this point, is if, again, you look at the time period, almost all of that period was with conservative Republican administrations in the United States. So the provisions relating to self-determination that especially folks on the religious right now object to were ones that, in fact, the Reagan administration generally had added. And they were doing it in Cold War thinking that if the Soviet Union was proposing entitlement rights, then the United States should propose civil liberties, and they would go back and forth in this way. Adopted in 1989, went into force very quickly, fastest ever, most widely adopted. The United States is a signatory, which means that it's obligated not to take action that's inconsistent with the convention, but it has not ratified, which means that it does not have force of law in terms of what one must do. So essentially every country in the world with a working government, except the United States, and you can make your own joke about that, has it ratified. The United States has not. What the United States has done, though, is to ratify the optional protocols on sale of children, child pornography, child prostitution, and on children in armed conflict, both of which the United States, again, was very actively involved in negotiating, but also very rapidly ratified. And that was in a bipartisan way, amazingly. There's a third protocol that just entered into force a couple of weeks ago and affects a very small number of countries. It's on the label, the jargon label is a communications procedure. It's really a complaint procedure. It's a provision that allows the Committee on the Rights of the Child to adjudicate complaints involving individual children after domestic law remedies have been exhausted. And I put that up mostly for two reasons. One is this is the only place where countries are really held accountable. And you can see this seemingly unanimous falling into line, and the convention as a whole and on the other optional protocols has not been the case on this one protocol that requires accountability. And the second thing that's interesting about it is that it's not what one might think of as the usual cast of characters. That is, you won't see Nordic countries on the list, for example. So countries that people think of as being relatively enlightened on children's issues and that have been active in the committee, for that matter, are generally not there. It's a fairly odd mix, Germany being the outlier in terms of a large country. But the ones that are noteworthy in terms of having had fairly substantial children's rights programs are Costa Rica, Spain, and Portugal. The others, as far as I know, have not in particular. So what the convention does, and people have different ways of parsing it, but it needs to be seen as a whole. And in my judgment, the overarching idea is the right to personality. And personality in international law essentially means something like personhood. It doesn't relate to the either colloquial or psychological meaning so much. But to put it into sort of lay language, it essentially is a right to be somebody. So it involves a variety of constituent rights, like the right to have one's birth registered, to have a name, to have a nationality, to have an identity, to have education so that one can allow one's personality to blossom, to have the basics of a standard of living that will allow that, essentially adequate for development, and so forth. There are a couple of other ideas that cross the convention that, in my judgment, are sufficiently broad that they justify being thought of as penumbral rights, not unlike the right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution. But it's not language that you see in the convention, but the ideas are there, and that they cross over. The right to personal security, to safety, and to protection of identity, and then in language that's original to the convention, and it isn't in the convention, the right to grow up in a family environment that's surrounded and supported by a strong community. The right to family environment is language that, as far as I've been able to tell, historically is accidental. That is, that Lopatka has no memory. This was language that was proposed by the Polish delegation in, I think, the second draft, and stayed in, but Lopatka has no memory of having had any discussions about it and so forth. But it was inspired language for a couple of reasons. One is that it's something that governments can be held accountable for. That is, you can't enforce a right to a family, but you can enforce a right to an environment that's conducive to family life. And it's also culturally neutral in the sense that it doesn't imply a particular kind of family or family rule, but allows, again, provides, essentially looks from the ground up, which is another thing that's important about the convention, is that it takes its viewpoint of the child. So it's the relationships the child regards as important and that are objectively important to children themselves that the convention supports and protects. So Article 12, which usually gets called the right to participate, again in the later documents from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, they call it the right to be heard, although they also use the language of the right to participate. This article is one that is unique in the sense that the language that's in it and even the idea that's in it is original to the convention. That is, there weren't any other international instruments that specifically recognize children as persons able to express opinions and to be involved in decision making. And there are two sections, as you can see. The first is the general, the second is the procedural one, and relates to the forums in which the right to participate is meaningful. But if you look at the languages, I want to get the pointer out because I did color coding in a sense. The first thing to note is that often when you get into discussion, certainly in health ethics this is true, that in determining where children's place is in both expression of opinions and in decision making, the inquiry very quickly goes to competency questions. And the point that I want to make here is the red language, which is that essentially if a child is able to express a preference, then that's all that's required for them to have the right to be heard. So if you think about that in practical terms, when a 2-year-old has a tantrum about something that's on the grocery store shelf that's within vision but not within arm length, and lets people know that he or she would like to have that, that's expressing a preference. That's not a high standard of competency. It's not a high standard of maturity. And the point that's important here is that Article 12 has no qualifiers. As you'll see in other rights related to civil liberties, both in general in the international arena for adults as well as children, and in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in particular, there are limits placed on self-expression and self-determination. There are no limits on self-expression under the Convention for children. It is pure speech, to use the legal jargon, and hence is protected at the highest level. Now, what is a qualifier, and it's not written there, is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, like any international instrument, regulates governments, not individuals, except under very specific circumstances, usually when people are acting as government officials, that they'll come under the rubric of international human rights law. So this does not directly regulate the way that a family works, but it does regulate the whole range of context in which the government comes into contact with children. And if you think about it, that's just about their whole life, except maybe for some aspects of home life, because they'll go to schools that are state regulated, often state administered, state financed. They'll get health care that at a minimum is state regulated, maybe state financed. They play in parks that are state owned, state regulated, state financed, etc. There are very few things that children do that don't come directly into contact with the government. So any of those settings I just mentioned, when a child has an interaction with a school teacher or a principal or with a health professional or with the recreation leader, they're coming into contact with the government in a way that for countries that are parties to the convention, there is an obligation to allow children to express their views about the matters that directly affect them, which again is a very broad scope. Where competency does come into play is with decision making. That is, that there is a right to speak, a right to be heard, but there's not a right to a particular decision. What is embedded in the right to be heard, though, is that one has to listen, taking into account the age and the maturity of the child. The second part of Article 12 relates to the forum. And basically what the convention says, implicitly at least, is that governments must create forums in which children are heard. Now that doesn't mean that every time a child's involved in an interaction with a teacher, they go to court or with a nurse or whoever. It does mean, though, that you have to provide some proceeding. And in general, proceeding in this context is very broad. So as an example, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that children can't be suspended from school without there being a due process. But it said there's enough. What counts for due process is a conversation. In that instance, with the assistant principal, probably. But that also applies more generally here. That is, that the convention establishes, in essence, rights to conversation, to being treated with some measure of respect, being heard, either directly or through a representative. And I'll not go into that part of it much here. The confusion about Article 12 is in this appositional clause, the views of, etc. And it's in the green, which is basically misplaced lawyerly language. What I think the drafters meant to say, if there weren't a bunch of lawyers writing it, is in the language that I've got down as the implied language, which is that children should have the right to express their views in matters that pertain to them, and then the weight that's given to those is dependent on the child's age and maturity. And again, implicitly, as children get older and more mature, that their views are given greater weight. There are places in the convention that participation as a word does show up, which gives some credence to the idea that participation is the core idea. But they're not in Article 12. And as you can see, they're in fairly disparate circumstances. That is, there's an absolute right of children, presumably, as there is of anybody who's directly concerned, presumably parents, foster parents, etc., to have a say in any proceeding that involves involuntary separation of the child from one or both parents. So this could be in a divorce proceeding, it could be in a foster care decision making, it could be in an immigration proceeding, and so forth. Children have a right to participate, again, in the arts. There's the language about government having to facilitate participation in the community broadly for children with disabilities, which relates, again, to this notion of being somebody. There's a series of other rights that are usually taken to be in concert with Article 12. And that, for the most part, and I'll give you the big exception in a moment, are ones that are taken directly from other international human rights instruments, particularly the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States is a party to, although it wasn't at the time that the drafting occurred. But historically, the United States has regarded civil and political rights as being sort of theirs, that it's part of Western liberalism with a small L. And so the provisions that were in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and some other instruments basically were just adopted without, frankly, much thought given to it. So again, this process that went on for some time, the representative of the Reagan administration would say, well, surely it's important to children as it is to everybody else to have freedom of religion, and there's a long history of protecting that as a human right, so we should make sure it gets into this document too. Everybody would say sure, and it happened. And that's pretty much what occurred. There are some exceptions to this, though. There were 5-point issues that were sticking points. That is, in 1988, at the meeting of the drafting group, were still points of controversy. One of them, not surprisingly, was the right of unborn children, which basically got dealt with by not dealing with it. So that many of the countries that have ratified have included declarations with their ratification that say by joining the Convention on the Rights of the Child or ratifying it, they're not either, on the one side, renouncing the rights to reproductive privacy, or on the other side, they're not renouncing the concept that fetuses are children, etc. And so the convention's silent on that, and since the drafting has not been an issue. Another one that was controversial but dispensed with very quickly was a right of children to respect their parents, which is a kind of an odd construction, which was proposed by Senegal and in fact was adopted as part of the African Charter on the Rights of the Child, as African children have a right to respect their parents. But it was dealt with in the drafting group by saying we will alter the right to education to include a provision that education has something to do with promoting respect for authority or legitimate authority, etc. What really got stuck, and there were a couple of others that were also hot buttons, so-called traditional practices in medicine, which is buzz phrase for female genital mutilation, was one that was there for quite a while, was ultimately included as a right to avoid. An international adoption was the other one. But the real hot button, the one that took the longest to resolve, was Article 14. And specifically, whether or not children have a right to choose their own religion. And the result of that was, again, a compromise whereby parents have the right and duty to provide direction to the child in the exercise of his or her right to religion in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. So it implies, at least, that parents have legally protected rights under international law to decide children's religion, but not to do it indefinitely. And most of the Muslim countries have reservations on that point when they ratify. All of the provisions that are on this list have qualifiers, as they do in other international civil rights instruments. In particular, that there's a right to protection of social order. This is the you can't yell fire in a crowded theater idea. So that governments can limit, put reasonable limits on the mode and timing and so forth of expression of views. The one that became the most difficult with this is Articles 13 and even more so Article 17. Article 13 is breathtakingly broad. It basically says children have a right to seek information through whatever media that they choose, wherever they choose and can find it, and to then communicate it to others as much as they wish. Very, very broad. I mean, this is goes beyond having a right of being able to see media, to actively get it, or to have it sent to you in a sense, to have access to it in a broad way. But Article 17, which specifies access to mass media from international sources, also says that the child has a right to media, especially when aimed at the promotion of social, spiritual, and moral well-being and physical and mental health. So basically Article 17 says, in a sense, qualifies Article 13, or it conflicts with it, one might argue, by saying that kids have a right to mass media as long as it's good for them, and particularly as long as it's good for health. And the provision gives a little bit of a balancing test by saying that the scope of that right needs to be looked at in terms of Article 13, freedom of expression, and Article 18, which has to do with parental responsibility. So to get to sort of the more fun part of this, now that you've seen what it is, or at least it's marginally more fun, is that this has not been an easy thing to implement. That is, Article 12 is the real bugaboo in the convention, to use a technical term, in that the Committee on the Rights of the Child periodically receives reports from all countries that have ratified either the basic document or one of the protocols. So basically every country with a working government, including the United States, reports periodically to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And the committee, which is an elected body, is elected by the states' parties, the countries that have ratified. The committee of experts hears reports from the countries themselves, the governments themselves, often shadow reports from non-governmental organizations, and then renders opinions about them. They're not enforceable, but they give, ostensibly at least, the sense of the international community about how well not only the countries are complying with the convention, but probably it's better to think of it as how well they are learning from the convention. Because it's really an aspirational document in many ways. And the basic point is self-determination and freedom of expression are difficult. So that by 2003, the committee had specifically admonished countries with respect to their fulfillment of Article 12, with respect to more than 150 countries, and in most instances, multiple times. So there's almost like a check-off. You're not doing anything to make it so kids really have a functional say, and then to specify what that means. And it's not surprising that it's hard because it requires new institutions in countries that often don't have much in the way of democratic institutions historically anyway, but also to reorder the relationship across the generations. And to do it in a context in which, in most of the world, young people aren't all that excited about being involved in decision-making and in self-expression. That is, that the tendency for at least 2 generations, probably longer, has been for increasingly less involvement among young people in political life in particular. A lot of distrust of government, but also distrust of other people and of each other. And the part of the problem structurally is that Article 12 is a substantive right. It gives you a right to express yourself, but it's also a procedural right. That is, it requires forums for doing that and says how decisions in effect are to be made. It's significant in that there's a lot of evidence, which I'll not try to elaborate here for time, but in general that kids who have opportunities to express themselves feel better about themselves, are more skilled in school kinds of activities, that they tend to view themselves and their communities as being more effective, hence they become more involved in civic life, etc. That has lasting impact. That is, by the time kids are in middle school, if they're not already involved in civic life, the likelihood they're going to be approaches 0. That is, the time at which political development or socialization, democratic socialization occurs is in the elementary school years, which goes against the conventional wisdom that's in adolescence. It's pretty much done by the time kids get to adolescence. In terms of kids having already acquired the basic values of the culture, basic political values, and also having made up in their mind they either will or won't be involved in civic life in broad sense. It is one where there's been some movement to think of this as, when I, for example, was asked to consult to the Israeli government in their Blue Ribbon panel that was designing their new children's law, they asked me a set of questions that I basically refused to answer as bordering on silly. But they're ones that are often asked, which is at what age should children be able to fill in the blank? And what they expected me to do was to come to them with a table that would say, kids should be able to drive at 16 or whatever. They should be able to make their own decisions about routine medical care at 9, to have an abortion at 15 or whatever. And it just makes no sense. In part because so much of the degree to which children appear and young people appear to be competent is based on the context that they're in, but also their experience in being able to make decisions. So the analogy I like to think of is with the epidemiology of child injuries. So when kids first start scooting around is when they first start discovering poisons, for example. When they first start going about the neighborhood is when they first discover that running in front of a car is not a wise thing to do, etc. Whatever the first year is of doing anything is bad. So we could set the driving age at 45, and we would have lots of incompetent 45-year-olds who were speeding about and being rambunctious 45-year-olds. And so that the idea is that what the real question here is not at what age should kids be able to do whatever to fulfill the spirit of Article 12, but it's instead how can government arrange things so that children or view themselves as being partners, as being taken seriously, as having something worthwhile to say, and as being able gradually to make more decisions, more serious decisions, in ways that are relatively protected. That the idea is that you structure things so that it's cascaded decision making. And that means then setting up structures that promote participation, which I'll say something about in a moment. There are a lot of reasons why this is important to society, the most obvious being in terms of socialization of democratic values, but also that ironically in making participation easier, making some measure of autonomy easier to express, ironically increases children's compliance. So if you really want to get kids to do what you want them to do, you let them decide, or at least appear to decide. And that it also promotes more respect for diversity, et cetera. Let me just focus on a couple of things on this slide. One is that the notion that parents' rights and children's rights are in a zero sum. That if children have an opportunity to speak, it means parents don't have an opportunity to speak. If children have a right to participate in decision making, it means that parents are less empowered. And that's just simply not true. One of the things about involvement, decision making, and self-expression by children is that it almost always involves multiple parties. And that doesn't mean that one party or another is especially privileged. It does mean, although parents have some greater status, at least for younger kids, it does mean, again, everybody has an opportunity to have a say. And in general, settings that promote parental involvement also promote children's involvement and vice versa. And which, again, makes some sense in terms of allowing for opportunities that essentially a setting, a culture of the setting that provides respect for people that aren't the ones running the setting, to put it a little bit awkwardly. But also of offering opportunities to see other people in the family, other people in the community being taken seriously. My general view is that competency is way overblown as a standard. I've already alluded to that, but let me go through a bit of why in this last sort of issue, in my judgment, focusing on children's competency takes you off course. There's essentially 4 different ways that you can conceive of competence in the law and decision making. The lowest standard, which is the one that you see in Article 12, is essentially the ability to express a preference. So that is relatively easy, relatively uncontroversial as to what it means. Whether it's a good standard or not is arguable. But it comes into conflict only when people are truly ambivalent. So something like, Mr. Smith, I would like to give you a shot. Can I do that? No. When you get that kind of a mixed message. But that's not the ordinary way of doing things. So that's a relatively easy one. Next level up is essentially understanding or a little bit higher appreciation. So one understands the nature of the decision, the risk and the benefits, et cetera. Another level up is you do something wisely with that so that not only do you understand what it is you're doing, but you weigh risk and benefits in rational economic style. The last of the standards, which is the one that's the most obtuse and doesn't fit in this continuum, essentially, is strong performance. So it's not whether or not you made a good decision in the sense of you understand what you're doing and so forth, but did you decide things the way we want you to? Is the decision that you made the one that a reasonable person, meaning I, would make? And that last standard is obviously the one that's least respectful of autonomy. But if you answer it positively and you regard people as being worthy of respect, then the other standards essentially become irrelevant. So in other words, if a child does the things, say in healthcare decision making, they make the right, in quotes, decision about when to seek help. We don't care about whether they're good in reasoning about it. What we care about is they are doing something we think is a good thing for them to do, and that we have some value on autonomy and privacy. So we can get a double duty in a sense of respecting the decision, but also of getting something that's paternally acceptable. So even in that standard, which is one that doesn't require kids to understand anything really about what's going on, it's in our interest to promote children's decision making. In the same vein, there's all kinds of evidence that adults generally don't do very well at decision making about complex matters. So there's the question of setting thresholds that are too high. There's the problem that, again, as I already alluded to, no matter where you set the age, inexperience becomes an issue, and that children benefit from the experience of actually making the decision. Let's get this. How kids themselves think about this. There's a lot of international research now on this, some of which I and students have contributed to. the basic findings been that young kids, which basically in this instance means preschool to maybe primary grades, don't perceive themselves as having choices even when they do. On the other hand, they value having choices. And so they will do things. They see having more options as itself being reinforcing at a very early age. Even among toddlers, that's true. It's also true, as I already alluded to, that kids have the basic understanding of the political systems they're in, of the values that govern them, etc., by the time that they're 8, 9, 10 years old, depending a bit on the context. And that being in a situation where one has more decision or has more real options, which basically means being in a wealthier family, better educated family, pushes that along a bit. But the exception is that in things that involve directly legal context, that having experience in the legal system turns out not to be effective in promoting children's understanding of it. The amount of times that they watch the Miranda ruling or giving Miranda rights doesn't have anything to do with how well they understand it, and so on. So what needs to be done then? And I already sort of telegraphed this, and I'll stop with this, and we can talk with questions or whatever, is that the fundamental problem of Article 12 ends up being creating structures that change the culture. That is, that how do you use government, how do you use law to make it so that participation becomes a way of life, that it's just taken for granted that you have a conversation with kids in the same way that you do with older folks. And there are a variety of ideas about that. One of the things that some countries have done is to create ombudspersons specifically for children. I studied the one in Norway, which was the first. And there, almost all the kids of school age not only had a pretty good idea of what the ombudsman or commissioner for children was supposed to do, but also knew who that person was, which was pretty remarkable. And it's sort of like, how many people can tell you who the lieutenant governor is? But kids in Norway can tell you who the ombudsman for children is and how to get to them. But that's in a culture in which there's been a long tradition of having ombudspersons who were essentially early on represented as the king, but it's not the greasing the wheels kind of an ombudsman in the way we use the term here. It really is people with strong levels of authority, moral authority, that are, in this instance, are given by the government, and are ones that everybody should listen to. So one possibility is adding voices. One of the ideas that a couple of groups I've been involved with has played with is giving legal status to somebody in an equivalent to godparents. There are statutes in many of the states for surrogate decision making, which is not what it sounds like in terms of surrogate parents. But in this instance, of parents designating another adult to act as a representative, a guide to children, to help them that parents dispose of their authority. This was set up as a way that parents who were HIV positive in the days when that was a more serious prognosis, giving them an opportunity to, in essence, define who was going to be involved in guiding their child. But there's no reason we can't do that sort of a process generally. That is, that parents and children together, for example, might decide that children should be able to make decisions about which classes they take, but that they need to talk to so-and-so before they do that. So parents won't get involved. They see that as something that's private of the child, but that there is a legal status that's given for doing it. Another example that I used in Israel was if we really are serious about empowering children in health care, what we should do is to change the standard of care, not change the standard by which the age at which children are able to consent. But if you change the standard of care through licensing, for example, so that health professionals have an obligation to have a conversation with children that they're treating or evaluating, that would have the same kind of impact. Very easy to do, low cost, requires training. A really good example of playing all this out in the context of building youth involvement in prevention of HIV and of health promotion across the whole community is work that Tony Earls and his wife Maya Carlson have done, which I'll not elaborate here except to refer to it. So to conclude, the central issue is, in my mind, is not whether or not we're going to treat children as adults, but instead whether we treat them as people, which means, do you have enough respect for somebody that you will, in fact, take the time to have a conversation, to be polite? And as a society, is that a norm that we're prepared to promote? This is my very favorite quote. I use it a lot. It's now a little bit out of date for reasons that will become obvious, but it was one that was used by Eleanor Roosevelt on the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she'd been very central in making happen. And her comments are that where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so small, so close they can't be seen on any maps of the world. That's obviously no longer relevant. But that they're the world of the individual person, the neighborhood, the school, the factory, the farm, the office. They're the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless those are given meaning, then rights have no meaning whatsoever. And we'll look in vain for progress elsewhere. So to come to the end of this, there's now a pretty extensive body of research about when it is that people view themselves as being treated fairly. And that's held up in a wide variety of cultures. In essence, one might think intuitively people view themselves as being treated fairly when they win in some dispute, when they get what they wanted. It turns out that's not very powerful, that it's instead the process, that people view themselves as being treated fairly when, first of all, they have a say. That's by far the biggest source of variance for children, again, as for adults. And the second is what in the literature gets defined as called ethical propriety. But it's basically being treated politely. You know, if you're in a police officer calls you Mr. or Ms. so-and-so, rather than honey or boy or whatever at the other extreme. That being treated as somebody who is somebody is really, in the end, what this is all about. And that if it happens, is a huge change in the history of humankind. And it suggests that maybe all of this stuff about human rights really means something. So I think we've got just a couple of minutes, or I can hang around too. Yes?
I'm a political scientist. Your point about, and an advocate for children's rights and voice and empowerment, your point about young people becoming increasingly cynical toward government, yeah, for good reason. On the other hand, you didn't address this, I just want your reaction. I see thousands of examples around the world, well documented, of young people standing up for their rights, wanting voice, wanting to participate, and so forth. So, to me, it's kind of a balance.
I think my reading of the studies on that point is in the industrialized countries, the so-called advanced democracies, that it seems to me that the evidence is just really overwhelming, that there's been a huge growth of cynicism about government, especially among young people. And what's bothersome to me about it is it's not just government, it's about life. And so that it's not just you can't trust the president, you can't trust the person who lives next to you either. And at the same time, a much higher value on material rewards in the end. So I don't see that as hopeless, but I do think it's a lot harder context in terms of which to get engagement. In the country, the emerging democracies, the evidence at first, after the first several years, most of this with national case studies, there was a lot of enthusiasm, especially among young people, which then hit with a thud. And the tendency now is to have much, say in the Baltic republics, very, very high proportions of young people saying they want to leave. I mean, upwards of 90%. And they don't want the old system, but they don't see what the new system is giving them meaningful voice either. So, and I think the answer on all of this, if there is one, this is oversimplifying, really is doing development at the local level, which is basically what the Earls approach is. They worked in Tanzania, worked in Chicago too, but the work that I cited is in Tanzania, where there is a unit of government that's the 2,000 to 4,000 size populations. And that's where they really tried to give the message of you can make a difference and that people can see it. So that's a kind of rambling sort of answer.
Do you think that a dramatic example?
I think there's someone else that has to come in, but maybe what we could do is, Gary, if you could wait a little bit.
Sure, I'll be glad to.
And then people could come up and ask you questions, because I don't want to interfere with our next class. Thank you very much.
Thank you.